Well, thank you all for being here this morning. My name is Jeff Grant. I'm on the board of directors at the Center for Object Relations, one of the co-sponsors for today's event. Thank you for all being here today and taking time out of your schedules to do so. Just want to say a few words about our event. Our event today isn't the product of one person or group. It's the result of a coordinated effort by individuals at a number of organizations and institutes that collectively make up the bulk of the psychoanalytic community in Seattle. Our intention was to host an event that begins a conversation in our community about the issues of race, racism, and systemic bias, and the role they play in how we practice, how we learn, and how we think about the work we do and its place in our world. For many of us, the events of 2020, and particularly the murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, Rayshard Brooks, just to name but a few, served as a tragic reminder that the intersecting problems of race and systemic bias, as they exist now and have existed for centuries, are an indelible part of the larger frame in which we do our work. Painful as it may be to admit this, we've also felt that not enough time and attention has been given to these problems at the various organizations of which we're all a part. If our discipline as a whole, and our community more specifically, is to be a part of the solution to these problems and not complicit in their propagation, it will be because we've all committed to sustaining a conversation about race amongst ourselves and within ourselves well into the future. And it's in the service of this goal that today's event was created. Now, in addition to our distinguished speaker, Dr. Zachary Green, I wanted to acknowledge a few of the people who made today's event possible. Thank you to Maxine Nelson at NPSI for initiating the creation and leading of the development of today's event. Thank you to Aaron Caruth from the Northwest Alliance for Psychoanalytic Study, who handled all the details related to registration and other technical aspects. Thank you to Josh Sandoz at the Center for Object Relations, who coordinated the breakout groups, of which you'll all be a part later today. And thank you to Rebecca Meredith at SIPSI, who helped with organizational details and recruited volunteers for the breakout group facilitation. And thank you to Roy Barsness in the Seattle School for Theology Psychology for bringing classes to join us today. You'll all be hearing from several of these individuals as we go forward. I just want to say a couple of technical things about your participation today. For those of you who may need assistance reading along or may be hard of hearing, we have two different options for you to be able to follow along. The Zoom live captioning, the live transcription is available at the bottom of the screen. And there's also a separate program called Otter AI, which will generate a live transcript in your internet browser. You can click that at the upper left-hand corner of your screen. Please message me in the chat if you have any trouble with that. Lastly, I just want to say we're recording, after much interest in this, we're recording the first portion of today's event. And it'll be available as a download for those of you who are interested in that. So with that, I'd like to introduce Maxine Nelson, past president of NPSI, who will introduce our presenter today.
Thank you, Jeff. Good morning and welcome to Speaking About Race, the Unconscious Roots of Structural Racism and Becoming Anti-Racist. Before introducing our esteemed presenter, Dr. Zachary Green, I would like to offer a context for our meeting by starting with a bit of personal history, which became the genesis for our gathering today. Please bear with me as I'll be meandering a bit in describing my journey. We are currently experiencing several epic phenomena simultaneously: the COVID-19 pandemic, resulting in over 400,000 deaths, and the epidemic of systemic racism and police brutality, which has resulted in the tragic deaths of far too many Black people and the ensuing demonstrations, which have erupted into riots and more police brutality. The final straw for me was the insurrection at the US Capitol a little over 2 weeks ago, which nearly destroyed our nation, before opening up a vista of hopefulness in the Biden inauguration, as embodied by Amanda Gorman's poem, The Hill We Climb. it seems like I was muted, so,
It cut off briefly, but you're back.
oh, it cut off briefly.
Sorry about
Okay.
that. Yeah, you're back in. We can hear
All
you.
right. The urgency of the present moment speaks to the fact that although the purview of our work as psychoanalysts and psychotherapists is primarily in our consulting rooms, we must simultaneously remain aware, allow ourselves to be impacted by, and ultimately to respond to what is occurring in external reality. Now, my journey. My first data point was a trip to Berlin for the 45th Congress of the International Psychoanalytic Association, the theme of which, appropriately enough, was repeating, remembering, and working through. On that trip, I learned that for Germans, the Second World War didn't actually end until reunification in 1990, and that in an attempt to detach itself from its Nazi past and Nazi shame, Germany turned Berlin, the symbol of its surrender and subsequent division, into an explicit showcase for that shame. While in Berlin, I encountered some of the many memorials that had been erected following reunification, including the memorial to the murdered Jews of Europe, occupying nearly 5 acres of land near the Brandenburg Gate, as well as some of the more than 8,000 stumbling stones commemorating homes where victims of the Nazis had lived. I recall being extremely moved by what I experienced then, but my awe quickly turned to shame as I contrasted what I was witnessing there with the fact that we as a nation had not yet begun the painful process of dealing with our racial past. In addition to these experiences, I had a number of very poignant encounters with German analysts who, knowing or suspecting that I was Jewish, came up to me, looked me in the eye, and apologized. I believe that they were attempting to work off some of their or their parents' and grandparents' shameful pasts. Second data point. In 2019, I read the book Learning from the Germans, Memory and the History of Evil by philosopher Susan Neiman. Neiman is an American Jew who grew up in Atlanta and who has lived in Berlin for the past 40 years, giving her a unique perspective for contrasting the ways Germany has dealt with its past with the United States, which, at least at the time of the book's publication, had not. I highly recommend the book. Half of the book is about Germany, the other half about the American South. In the book, Neiman introduces the term, and I'm going to say it slowly because it's got 8 syllables, Vergangenheitsbewältigung, which translates as working off the past. Connected to the psychoanalytic concept of working through, Neiman uses the term to speak to the deep connection between present-day racial violence in America and our ignorance and refusal to work with the fact that racism has been embedded in our very fiber as a nation from the beginning. The last piece of this genesis occurred with George Floyd's death on May 25th, 2020. For me, as for most of us here today, his was just one Black death too many. It wasn't the first that we saw on video, but it was certainly the most excruciating, not only because we saw a dying man cry out for his mother, but also because we witnessed the face of another man, blank and banal in its brutality, who had nearly 9 minutes to change his mind about committing murder, but ultimately chose not to. The fact that George Floyd's death, as well as the deaths of Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and Rayshard Brooks, occurred during the worst pandemic in over 100 years, brought these issues of systemic racism into much sharper focus and made it impossible for us to turn our eyes away. Oddly, the coronavirus gave us a chance to see how deeply we are connected and vulnerable to the same diseases, as well as the ways inequalities persist, even in cultures that purport to condemn them. This raises some interesting questions. Is racism a disease? And as witnesses to the pandemic raging in our country, can we think about racism as a pandemic as well? I would now like to introduce Dr. Zachary Green. I've had the pleasure of getting to know Zachary since our initial meeting last July and have found him to be both profoundly wise and deeply humble. I've also appreciated his creativity, warmth, and playful sense of humor. Zachary is currently the Director of Leadership Development at the University of San Diego, where he is also lead faculty for the RISE Urban Leadership Fellows. He received a doctorate in clinical psychology from Boston University and completed advanced clinical training at Cambridge Hospital, part of Harvard Medical School, and also at Georgetown University. Throughout his career, Zachary has focused on race through the lens of groups and group relations. Steeped in the theories of Klein and Bion, Zachary has done leadership training on 5 continents, working with multinational corporations, government agencies, NGOs, universities, religious institutions, and nonprofit entities, in addition to serving on the President's Commission on Race during the Clinton administration. He is co-founder of Group Relations International and a fellow of the A.K. Rice Institute. Celebrating 30 years of group relations work, Zachary has directed nearly 20 conferences and staffed dozens more in the United States and internationally. We're truly fortunate to have him lead us today. Over our many conversations, I've experienced Zachary as a devoted scholar and teacher. He currently lives in San Diego with his husband and 2 sons. And now I'll turn the program over to Zachary.
Thank you very much, Maxine, for that incredibly gracious introduction. And thank you all for being here. I really appreciate the fact that this session itself is emblematic of much of what I'm going to talk about. It is the joining of 4 organizations that I have come to learn have an interesting, complex, and textured history and present moment. So Northwestern Psychoanalytic Society and Institute, Northwest Alliance for Psychoanalytic Study, Center for Object Relations, Seattle Psychoanalytic Society and Institute, and those students that are here from the Seattle School. I thank you for all being here. And I also want to thank Maxine and Jeff for the way that you began, because I was going to do a whole thing about the context in which this has been embedded. And you did what is often not the case. You named the names of the people who brought us to this moment, at least in terms of consciousness in this pandemic. What my job today is to really illuminate on a very different level how we might think about these issues from both an individual and a collective level. This is going to be an exploration. It is going to be part of a seminar on race and anti-racism. But another part of it will then allow us to begin to do this exploration so that we can think about, as I am in my practice, as I am a part of one of these organizations, as I am learning about these things, how do I find myself? Where am I located? And then in addition to that, how might we begin to think collectively about our responsibility? When we begin to think about these things together, it works really powerfully. As way of background, I'm a clinical psychologist by training, but as was referenced in the introduction, much of my work has been around these issues of race, whether I want to or not. I think it's a function of being born on the cusp of the civil rights era and being one of those first pioneer families of integration. And as a consequence, I've been bridging this space for my entire life. And then it has invited me to try to find language for this experience. And I hope some of the language that I bring forward in this, along with a number of scholars and cultural specialists or experts, will help. So let's see where we take this journey, and we'll go from there. So the whole idea of this is to really begin to understand something about the unconscious roots of systemic racism. And for us together as a community, and for those of you in Seattle, and the predominant whiteness of this. And so I recognize that I'm primarily speaking into a space of whiteness, but that's incomplete in and of itself, which I'll talk about later. Because there are blind spots that we have professionally that's inherent in this. And then how do we understand this in the context of white supremacy? And so I think we're being recorded now. And so I hope we are. Yeah, I can see the little button. So let's continue from there. Okay. So thank you, Breonna Taylor, because she gave us language from the beginning. And this is a line that's in the first stanza of her wonderful poem, The Hill We Climb. We learn that quiet isn't always peace, and norms and notions of what just isn't always justice. And yet the dawn is ours before we knew it. So our invitation here is to begin to think about this dawn. And so an overview of what just is for us will be speaking of race and the challenge. And we're going to get immediately then into the whole notion of what an anti-racist journey may look like. I invite your critique, your thoughts, your feelings about this. We're going to use an approach based on a paper that I wrote on racial inquiry, which is about compassion, curiosity, and common humanity. But it has a foundation in terms of structural racism and systemic racism. How we understand these terms as spaghetti wired together, the systemic aspects of that. Then we're going to use Frantz Fanon and his notions of human consciousness, along with other ways of thinking, so that we get to a taxonomy of whiteness in this journey to racism. And then we're going to find time in the breakout groups. And as we get closer to those, then I'll make some reference to what we will do. And no doubt there will be questions and comments along the way. And so we'll deal with that as it emerges. So we have a central inquiry here. And by that, from the poem, the dawn is ours. In what ways might we embrace this dawn and face issues of race with greater consciousness, curiosity, and capacity for ourselves, our communities, and our organizations? So I'll ask you to ponder that consideration. Really ponder that. What does it mean to bring greater consciousness and curiosity so that we can have that capacity? What does it mean to think about this on multiple levels concurrently? Because we in the group relations community think about things on the intrapersonal level, the interpersonal level, the group's voice, and the systemic voice all at the same time. And this presentation is a movement between all of those places and spaces, thinking and feeling without neglecting one for the other. And if we can do that, then we may have a chance to begin this conversation. So let's take that to the next level. Frantz Fanon will be one of the highlighted theorists, because I want you to think about some of what he wrote about. One of his favorite constructs was that of lived experience, the sort of phenomenology that we bring to the moment. And one of the ways that he wrote about this is sometimes people hold a core belief that is very strong. When they are presented with evidence that works against that belief, the new evidence cannot be accepted. It would create a feeling that is extremely uncomfortable. And we call it cognitive dissonance. And because it is so important to protect the core belief, they will rationalize, ignore, and even deny anything that doesn't fit in with the core belief. Pause for a second. Think about yourself. When I first encountered this thinking, it really upset me because it invited me to consider that I had such rigid beliefs around things that if I were challenged around it, my natural inclination would be to reject it. It is around this issue that we often find ourselves in a similar circumstance, where it really challenges core beliefs that we don't even realize that we're in. And so how might we then encounter our lived experience in a different kind of way? See, the reason that we're often in this is because of our bubbles and our echo chambers, and all outside of that are all of these things that are going on concurrently. There are unconscious mechanisms. There's confirmation bias, implicit bias. There's the insulation and the self-sealing nature of chosen narratives that get socially reinforced, and all of these things help us to stay exactly where we are. My job today is to burst that bubble just a little bit. You can put it back in after I finish, but for the next hour, try to stay with me, because this is where we're going to start from the get-go, which is a fancy way of saying, let's begin to look at this from the beginning. Now, those of you who like these kinds of things, this is going to be fun. For others of you, what is this man doing? Well, let's begin to find the journey. One of the issues when we talk about an anti-racist orientation is the propensity to think of this in binary terms. And unfortunately, this binary thinking also lends itself to polarity. Problematic. What my colleagues and I have been working on for the last year, and especially since the extrajudicial deaths that were alluded to earlier today, there's this place between those who believe that none of this exists and those who want to dismantle the system. And we act as if that's it. What if that's not it? What if there's a grand middle where most of us reside most of the time, where there are all kinds of things that are going on that are a part of this journey? So if we think of not racist and anti-racist as not an either or, but as a continuum, then how do we move from denial to dismantle? And how do we celebrate the fact that we may be where we are? At the top, you have sort of like the nature of this journey. It is a journey from a space of sort of indifference where this doesn't affect my life, to one as we get to greater proximity to what it represents for us, where it is no longer something that's out there, but that it is something that is in here and around me. Then it leads to greater engagement. So that's on one hand. The other part of this is then, what about the notion of passivism? What is passivism? Well, passivism is sort of like, it's there, but I really don't have to address it. But then there's this moment of arrival. In contemporary language, we call it woke. But that word has been used so much that it's rendered meaningless, towards activism. And many of us are someplace in the journey from that sort of passive space to more of an awakening towards an activism. And then in the middle, what you see is that there are different elements and expressions of what it means to move from saying, I'm not racist, to being anti-racist, where in spaces like this, sometimes there are only a certain percentage of people who are people of color, who are Black, who are Indigenous. And sometimes it's about our voice and how we lend our voice to these circumstances. When BIPOC individuals are there and present, then how do we become allies? How do we stand alongside, where we take a step back for a moment to allow those voices to come forward? In the movement, the language that is preferred is that of an accomplice, someone who's really willing to get in there with you. But a language that we and my colleagues have begun to talk about is the notion of an accompanist. If we think of like a Leontine Price, she is a wonderful historical figure of the opera, Denise Graves. But there was always with her, or with them, an accompanist, someone who is nameless, but their virtuosity was also important in terms of rendering that beautiful aria. And so how do we think about where are we? And I will ask you to think about, on this line between indifference to engagement, where are you right now? In terms of this line between passivism and activism, where are you right now? In this continuum between denial and dismantling, where are you right now? And are you more an advocate, an ally, an accomplice, or an accompanist? Or are you at different moments in different places? And from a group relations perspective, we would say you're in different places all at the same time. Now the fun part. So unfortunately, the way that racial discourse is often handled is as if it is a single journey with one location. And my colleagues and I have said, absolutely not. And what happens is then, therefore, a shame and blame cycle, that if you are not where I am, then I will shame you because you should be where I am. And then there's also then the corresponding blame of why aren't you further along than you are? Let's back away from all of that. Let's honor where we may be, because by locating where we are, then we have an opportunity to begin to get someplace else. As I alluded to on the previous slide, it often is an indifference of where we start. You know that something's happening, but I don't want to get involved with that. And there are issues, if you think about that beyond race, where this may be the case. I'll give you an example. In terms of issues of the environment and climate change, I know that they exist, but it is only in this pandemic period that the disproportionate impact of those environmental issues on communities of color, that my indifference has moved further down the continuum. In terms of how we are talking about issues of gender and gender fluidity, there was a moment just a year ago when some of my young students, when they began to use pronouns and things of that sort, I just could not wrap my head around it. But now I begin to understand that. So let's do this in terms of race. Is there a silence that we have? That when we begin to know it, that we have fear of how we're going to be perceived. And so therefore, we don't say a word. But as I said, this sort of arrival, this sort of awakened space is where it's like there's a fervent understanding, but there's so many errors because I haven't done my own work around these issues. The next part is this sort of passivism. And a passivism is I'll click a like on social media. I will make a comment to, like that one person, but it isn't much beyond that. And then one of the big critiques, especially in the middle of the pandemic, as we were dealing with these issues of race, was the argument that the statements that people were putting out and things of that were only performative. Performative meaning that it is something that we read, it's something that we post, it's something that we state, but we are not necessarily yet in it, but we do feel compelled to do something. The informative level is you're ready to speak. You're ready to begin to at least do so with colleagues and friends. This event represents informative. It represents a willingness to engage the conversation with colleagues across four organizations and a fifth with the school. It also includes all of you who are in private practice who are here and present to this event. But then the real question, and one of the debates that you're having within and between the organizations right now, is that this is not enough. Some have given voice to advocacy and activism being what this has to be about. That means really speaking out in a public way that influences behaviors. It means moving towards activism where we're beginning to deal with, am I an ally? Am I an advocate? Am I an accomplice? Am I an accompanist? And am I willing to risk something other than an ideology or a thought in terms of my behavior? And then there's the movement towards what can be called either revolutionary, according to how you're thinking about this, or this level could be named anti-racist, where the actual advantages that one has are challenged. And you're willing to put those on the line, cherished ways of being and knowing, to dismantle current systems of the status quo. So now it's your turn. You can do it either way, but I'm going to ask you to put this in the chat. Look at these 9 boxes. You're someplace on this continuum. I do this work, and I would love to say that I'm purely anti-racist. That's not actually true. Most of the time, I spend my energy in the informative to activist continuum. That's pretty much where I am. That's me, and I do this. I understand the anti-racism piece, but by virtue of the fact that I work in a white institution and that I have a background that privileges that kind of pedigree, then that means that there's something about that element that is a part of my own lived experience and history that I've accepted. And for me to then shift that means shifting, as Fanon talked about, a whole way of thinking about myself. And most days of the week, I'm not quite ready to do that. So I'm going to give you literally 30 seconds. Find the chat. And if you don't want to say where I am, just think about where you think your organization is or your colleagues are. And begin. Let's see what emerges. Some activism, lots of, okay, thank you for owning the passivism. Good. Yes, some performative pieces. There's a revolutionary, thank you. Okay, very good. Okay, and take another 10 seconds. Wonderful. Okay, so what I would invite you to do is scroll through this, and what you will see is that with us, all 250 of us, that we are in a continuum. And so the conversation is in the continuum. When we insist on the polarities, we know from our profession that what we're insisting on is a sort of a primitive splitting dynamic. I mean, how basic in terms of Kleinian thinking can we be? And so what I would now invite us to do is to think about this a little bit further. The way that we are talking about this is from a racial inquiry lens. And what I mean by racial inquiry is that there is compassion, curiosity, and common humanity, but it's not as simple as that. Let me take it a little bit further. When we talk about racial inquiry, what we're talking about is that this curiosity has to be wedded with compassion. And what I mean by that is that can we feel with the other? In other words, is our investment in how we think so powerful that we do not hear the others. So can we just allow the question to be there? And right now, can you just allow the question to be present as we talk about these issues? But there is one condition, and the one condition is that we begin to think about this in terms of systemic racism, and that the social historical realities of systemic racism are pretty much acknowledged. That doesn't mean that there isn't debate on that. We're allowed to debate on that. But we acknowledge that there is a perspective, that there is a thing called systemic racism. And through that, then our exploration in this inquiry is then, where are the places and spaces of our shared humanity, our common humanity? But how do we also understand this in terms of our unique individuality, our stories, and what it is that we are bringing to this circumstance? So those of you who like graphics can think about it this way. From the curiosity and compassion, then what we are recognizing is that systemic racism is there. Okay, so let's be curious about what that is. There are unique aspects of my own history. Okay, can we be curious about that as well? When we are in the conversation with each other, can we have compassion about the different places where we are in terms of the continuum, so that we can begin exploring the spaces of our common humanity? What a lot of people want to do is go straight to the common humanity, or there is the investment in their own individual particularity, or there is a critique of systemic racism. Racial inquiry asks us to hold all of that at the same time. Because when we don't, then we're caught in structural racism. Now, I use the word systemic, institutional, and cultural and historical racism as one term. And the reason for that is that there are nuances in the literature among scholars in this area. But for our purposes, we're going to shift from structural racism to talk about systemic racism. So systemic racism in Fagan's work is the literature on this. Systemic racism in US society is an organized whole with complex, interconnected, and interdependent social networks, organizations, and institutions that routinely embed racial oppression. Most basic, and the key word is basic, elements and institutions of racial oppression in US society have endured over time, even as some significant changes have taken place. This week obviously represents symbolically significant changes that have taken place, but it does not negate the historical and cultural realities. And so what are you saying? Well, there are certain cultural and historical realities. While we do have our first female vice president of color, issues of power imbalance still continue to exist. If we look at the Senate and we look at the House, though there are more women and people of color than ever, the relative representation continues to be an issue. Historically, legal barriers through the Jim Crow laws are a representation of the structural elements of this. The Three-Fifths Compromise is a constitutional designation that suggests that people of African descent, though property at the time, were still less than a full man, and man is important. The alienated relationships, the way that splitting off, even as we talk about in terms of issues around our own border, are an aspect of that, but they are also perpetuated in terms of how family separation is nothing new in this country. It is part of the legacy of enslavement. Economic wealth disparities through the redlining and through other policies that really have meant that property generationally and therefore wealth generationally could not be created is an aspect of that. issues of education access and achievement that are perennial. There are multiple elements of that, and that is its own debate. And I just was on a webinar about that 2 days ago. And these issues continue to be present, and how they are present is subject to debate. Employment discrimination. One of the curves that you will see during COVID is that while there was some recovery before we went into the pandemic more deeply again, what languished was the employment of African Americans. It continued to decline during the time. The legacy of mass incarceration and then the criminalization of behavior as a function of Jim Crow laws and a strategy of certain administrations in the past 4 decades then leads to generational trauma, which then also is a part of extrajudicial killings, which is a part of implicit narratives that we carry around us. Well, what do you mean by implicit narratives? Implicit narratives, where is that right now, as I'm speaking, some of you are giving an explanation for each of these. This is what we do. We have an explanation for, well, the extrajudicial, well, there's a criminal behavior. Well, the education issues, well, that is a function of, well, you know, the poor schools and, you know, and then the problems there. Well, the generational trauma. So each of these has an explanation that is a part of implicit narratives that also are a part of the structural racism. And then this leads to a real, true element, where we see that there's a reduced life expectancy as a function of race. When we talk about structural racism, we talk about it this way. But for those of us in a psychotherapeutic place, that's not enough. We need to get to the meaning of this. And the meaning of this is when we focus on individual prejudice or our own individual journey, it's insufficient because it can obscure the institutional and cultural elements of this, that all of these things go together to create this hierarchy. And by that, what I mean is that this is reproduced unconsciously in everyday environments. What we do is that there's an implicit way that we show preference in automatic actions. And when we are in a therapeutic context, one of the things that we're doing is that we do not even recognize that we have fixed, learned, and chosen narratives that we are bringing into the context. Because these create collective memory. The collective memory is then understood in a certain cultural context and a certain meaning that we attribute to history. We also then enshrine this in terms of cultural and artifacts and symbols. And those symbols then begin to be the basis through which we see the world. And all of this is so unconscious and so powerful that they are then resistant to dismantling because they're interconnected. And more importantly, they're reinforced through our shared in-group experiences. And so therefore, the symbols that are in the background are 2 elements of how these cultural artifacts are there. One of the things that happened in terms of the storming of the Capitol is it represents something about a seat of democracy. But superimposed on that is this noose, which also has meaning and significance. And for that to have been placed in advance of the storming says something about the ways in which, at the depth of the unconscious, these elements are powerful juxtapositions that I'll talk about a little bit further. So the unconscious roots are in our language and a part of what our work is. We see it in the narcissism of small differences. When we talk about where Freud went with this, as he began to see what was happening in Europe, he really looked at the space between Eros and Thanatos. And then in looking at that space between Eros and Thanatos, then he was trying to say, what is going on that this death drive is so prominent? When we think about it, maybe even right here, how our small differences play out with one another, how our small differences then become exacerbated. And then this exacerbation leads to primitive splitting, where the other becomes the bad object. Race is a proxy for those kinds of things, because if we begin to think of race as a construction as opposed to a reified entity, then we are using it as a symbolic representation of the projection of shadow, the projection of those elements of us, of our group, that we place onto others, and therefore leads to a failure of mirroring. For those of us who are African American people of color, then we have a choice. In order to survive this, there's often an identification with the aggressor or the oppressor, so that we can begin to work through it. Otherwise, we are subject to intersectional trauma. And what that means that in addition to my individual trauma that I am bringing to this situation, there's also the generational historical element that is brought to this as well. And what often happens in cross-racial psychotherapeutic encounters is that the reality of the social, historical, generational elements are denied and rejected because of the hierarchy in psychotherapy, as opposed to incorporated and understood as real as the family trauma that I may have for my early development, for which I have no language. All of these elements are the challenge for us in psychotherapeutic context to begin to consider how each of these and more may be at play. So let's talk about failure of mirroring. I'm using Ralph Ellison here, who wrote the brilliant book, Invisible Man. And you can see how the failure of mirroring and the presence of projection are here in what is offered. I am invisible. Understand simply because people refuse to see me. It is as though I have been surrounded by mirrors of hard, distorting glass. When they approach me, they see only my surroundings, themselves, or figments of their imagination. Indeed, everything and anything except me. Think about what is being offered there. Think about that in terms of the language of our profession. Think about that as a symbolic representation of the larger conversation. Now, systemic racism also has other unconscious roots, and that as a person of color, these are things that I'm often grappling with. And this is one that I call adaptive introjection, not just introjection as we think about in terms of the usual ego defense, but an adaptive introjection is a social, historical, cultural artifact where the word lynching comes from a slaver named Lynch, who would then beat the children of women who were enslaved. And so that the women would then go tell their boys that this would be the consequence. And so therefore, the historical trauma was something that was from the very beginning taught. And then it began to be that the beating was no longer necessary because the narrative was embedded. Adaptive introjection then was used to survive the period of enslavement. And that adaptive introjection was a part of my own lesson very early on in terms of being on this cusp of the civil rights movement, where there were certain ways and certain concepts of being that I had to consider and that were a part of my training as a child before I was even 5 years old. When we think about healthy and unhealthy false self, we talk about the holding environment, but if you are in a situation where this kind of introjection is a part of your first 5 years, then the holding environment of the family and the maternal object is not all there is. there's a larger societal and cultural context where that is unsafe. And so the voice, the self that you express, then becomes one of double consciousness, of multiple personae, where code switching is a necessary part of the survival strategy. And a projective identification exists because any person of color then is a vicarious representation of you. In my paper on the denigrated other with my mentor, Marvin Skolnick, we talk about the difference between the paranoid schizoid position and the depressive position, but let me go beyond that paper to talk about, in the paranoid schizoid, the challenge that I have as an African-American person is that if I have the gratification of the abreaction, that puts me in a position where I am endangering my life, or at least that's the lesson that I had to interject. And therefore I have to be hyper vigilant of my own behavior. Now, if I move to the depressive position, then what I'm doing is then I'm sublimating the rage that is a part of the experience. And it also then clinically, as we know, as that anger is turned inward, becomes a depression. What Fanon then invites us to think about it in terms of a phenomenology is the master-slave dialectic, where in order for us to be liberated from that is the encounter with Thanatos, but the encounter of Thanatos transformed, where freedom is more important than death, because it is through that that I come to consciousness. So let's see how this plays out. So double consciousness is a construct that was developed by W.E.B. Du Bois. And W.E.B. Du Bois said, one ever feels his two-ness, an American and a Negro, two souls, two thoughts, two unreconciled strivings, two warring ideals in one dark body, whose strength alone keeps it from being torn asunder. When I first encountered this, I recognized that by being on the cusp of the civil rights movement and being first generation integration, the part of me that was attempting to assimilate into a primarily white environment, and the part of me that was a Southern, quote, Negro, were constantly in battle. When I would go visit my grandmother in Columbus, Georgia, the people would say, why do you talk so proper? And then when I would come back to Shaker Heights, Ohio, then they would say, why y'all say y'all? And so therefore I would find this encounter of being pulled between these places and trying to figure out how to hold this as a kid under the age of 12. The adaptive interjection can be found in this poem by Langston Hughes, and his famous poem on Harlem, in terms of what happens to a dream deferred. Does it dry up like a raisin in the sun? Or fester like a sore ant, then run? Does it stink like rotten meat, or crust over and sugar over it like a syrupy sweet? Maybe it just sags like a heavy load, or does it explode? Each line of this speaks to the choice that is carried through this construct of race, the reality in which we live. So this helps us to understand it, that race between us all is this mutual projective process of anger and rage, of self and other. I like to think about, and my colleagues and I are beginning to write about this, is the notion of that underneath this depressive position, we put a more popular language of silent grief. And by silent grief means that there is a way that if we accept this, then we have to grieve a relationship that we've come to know, even though it leads to, on the other hand, unspoken trauma. The hurt, the shame, and the sadness are a function of this aggression that we perpetuate onto each other. because the vulnerability is so hard to hold. And so we, in the psychotherapy context, may not recognize the unconscious ways that we participate in a mutual projection process that is a part of the story that we carry, and how some of our actions as therapists are enactments of that aggression. And so the self and the other then leads to this hurt, shame, and woundedness that does not allow us for much room to move. Where I want to begin to take this, though, is then how does Fanon help us? Because Fanon helps us in terms of its implications for psychotherapy. So even though his work was much more about the larger cultural ethos, we can begin to look at it in terms of this. Because what Fanon talked about is man is human only to the extent to which he tries to impose himself on another man, in order to be recognized by him. As long as he has not been effectively recognized by the other, it is this other who remains the focus of his actions. His human worth and reality depend on this other and his recognition by the other. It is in this other that the meaning of his life is condensed. When we use race as a real thing as opposed to a construction, then what we are doing is that there's a mutual process of recognition, that my consciousness is a function of you recognizing me. But then indeed, your consciousness is a function of me recognizing you. This phenomenological thinking was not originated by Fanon. It was also a part of Hegel's dialectic. And so when we put these things together, then what we begin to think about is what Fanon talked about, and then one of my professors at Boston University developed, was this oppression cycle, where in the oppression, what happens is that first there's an experience of alienation. And that we as therapists need to think about, what does it mean in terms of being a person of color or any kind of marked difference, be it the narcissism of small differences or these macro constructed differences, that allows us to see that I experience myself as alienated from the general other. These are the alienated relationships to which I alluded to earlier. But this alienation then leads to the specific other. One of the narratives we have is, well, what about, in addition to the extrajudicial killings, what about Black on Black crime? Well, Black on Black crime can be understood as the interjection because there's a rejection of that which is me. And that which I cannot handle within myself, then I want to then eliminate. And so the specific other begins to be a function of that alienation. But then what we've learned in the last decade is that the suicide rate among Black people has increased. And so the alienation towards self is also a part of that. But oppression in that respect is not only in terms of alienation. There's this notion of social genetic death before we get to actual death. And social genetic death means that the language and the culture is stripped away. And as the language and culture are stripped away, and it becomes literally illegal to speak one's own language. And in the history of the indigenous, especially in this country and in Australia, to speak one's own language, to do one's own cultural practices, then means that social genetically, my connection to an identity, my capacity to share my narratives are lost. And for many, that actually leads to death. Then there's a process of then what I understand myself to be is erased or deraced, so that I am merely the shell of a projective object, a denigrated other, where I live in this paranoid schizoid space of hypervigilance, or I can only survive through introjection. The way out of this is often violent revolt, and we see in the legacy of the colonial period that was the case. But often in these revolts, there's a retro-oppression. And only in a few cases do we see that there's a healthy renewal. Some would argue that South Africa, through its truth and reconciliation process, is an example of that healthy renewal. But some would argue that there are elements of retro-oppression, and often all three of those are present, and then the cycle begins again. We as therapists are enacting this cycle often, unconsciously and implicitly. So our challenge is to recognize how these issues may be at play. So as my professor, Dr. Bulhan, put it, this decision to die for freedom, to change one life, the oppressed must risk not only the deadly combat with the oppressor, but also a perilous dislocation of the oppressor within. The dual struggle may result in death, madness, or freedom. It so happens that victims of prolonged oppression are more familiar with death and madness. Okay, now what about whiteness? Well, whiteness works like this. We want to jump to white supremacy as an issue, but I don't think we can do that. There's a taxonomy around white identity that has to be understood. And this is one formulation, and there are many others, and those of you who have this lived experience perhaps characterize it in different kinds of ways. But whiteness is the larger societal endemic processes that are invisible. It is our standards of beauty. It is our representation in terms of positions of authority and power. It is what we take to be the norm. When I did my dissertation, I wanted to understand this alienation process to which I alluded to among African Americans. And I wanted to understand how young people at different ages who were African American experienced alienation and whether they were able to recognize, be mirrored by mentors. My hypothesis was that Black folks didn't recognize mentoring and that mentoring programs were insufficient because of that. I was allowed to do the dissertation, but I had to have a white comparison group. I argued that that's really not what I wanted to study. I wanted to understand how this operated at different levels of Blackness, chronologically, developmentally, and they said, no, you have to have the white group. So the standard is the notion of whiteness. Now, white advantage then are all of the sort of antecedents of that, where you can expect to live longer, you can expect to get a loan, from a bank. You can recognize that wealth may be something that is afforded. Now, what happens when we talk about advantage, people talk about in terms of their own lived experience, in terms of social class or immigration or religious identity, that I did not have that. But what we have to understand this is that the advantage is embedded into the larger whiteness. I am a product of whiteness, but I do not necessarily carry white advantage. And then white supremacy is then a subset of all of that, which basically says that not only is this normative, this is correct, and that there's a hegemony that goes along with this that is culturally supported and reinforced. And so what the argument is among many cultural scholars is that the denial of what whiteness does in terms of status quo then implicitly makes us complicit with supporting white supremacy. Now that's a tough argument for a lot of people. So let me do it a little bit more directly, which is now being called Morong Syndrome. Morong Syndrome is one that I learned about from my colleague, Ed Shapiro, who's a psychoanalyst, psychiatrist from the Austin Rigs. And what he sent me was this. The whole notion of the Morong Syndrome, and I was going to play the music, but I think that's over the top, is that it's characterized by this notion that there's a twilight of the gods. And it means that the world as it exists now is that of us being the gods. It means that it leads to a real narcissistic rage. And this rage is because being a part of the privileged class, my entitlements are being threatened or challenged or even taken away. And sometimes this syndrome begins simply by the threat of it, but it requires to really be the syndrome, denial of complicity in the harm, inequities, or oppression that's placed on others, and then the privileges that were acquired as a function of that. The symbol of the Capitol building being one that was partially constructed through slave labor is an example of that. And so here is this both the symbol of liberty and of democracy, but also of this legacy. And for it to be stormed really symbolically, representationally from a group relations perspective, means that I would prefer to tear it down. So it entails a refusal to recognize the reality of the other, because to do so would mean that the reality that I know is no longer present, and that is experiences death. And so this regressive fear then leads to the notion that I would prefer to destroy the world than inhabit one where I no longer have this privilege. So some would say, what an extreme way of thinking, but we have the evidence that plays in the background of this photograph of just one way that might be present. So here we are, back at the beginning, where denial and dismantling are held. I hope that in this hour, what I have been able to invite us to do is to think about this more completely, to recognize that while we may say we're not racist, there are racist elements that are present, and that this racism is systemic. But I hope there's also a way of seeing that we're in a journey, and to remind you that we're in this journey together, and that we are in different places and spaces, and it's really okay to be in different places and spaces, even though we may encounter people who are in a different rectangle here, who then believe that we should be where they are. And that leads to a disaggregation. But we as therapists need to understand that we are often in different places than our patients, than our clients, than those who we serve. And then how might we understand where they are so that we can be as one in our work? So this leads us to get ready for our breakout groups. No doubt there are going to be things that you want to talk about together about what I said, and that's all fine and good. But the facilitators have been invited to have that be less of what this session is about. The breakouts are to give a quick view of what it is that we're going to talk about. And then what it is to invite you to two levels of questions. One is about the advantage that you may have in terms of these psychotherapeutic relationships, beyond the sort of traditional understanding of transference and countertransference and dominance and the meaning of that, but to really think about this in terms that we've been talking about today. And to move that to the collective level, because this all has something to do with how we think about training our practices and our organizations. And so your facilitators will have these questions. In some of your groups, you're going to spend the entire time just talking about what I talked about. I understand that. But I am asking facilitators really try to at least address one of these questions so that we can get into a deeper conversation. It would be easy to be in a reactive mode to this talk and more challenging to be curious about how we are thinking together so that we can move our journey to the next level. So I'm going to leave it there for now. And then I'm going to turn it over to Josh because we're slightly ahead of schedule. And so then Josh will then talk about then how we're going to move these into the groups. And I have more to say later, but we'll leave it there for now. Okay.
My name's Josh Sandoz, for any of you that, that we haven't met in person. I am on the board of directors with CORE, the Center for Object Relations. I'm the outgoing president there and the current chair of our events committee. And it's been a real privilege to work with Maxine and Aaron and Rebecca with the co-sponsoring organizations since July, working towards this morning. But the privilege has been so much more just magnified in that we've been able to work with Dr. Green every step of the way. And Zachary, I just want to take a moment here before we step into our groups to say thank you. Thank you so much for all the work with us leading up to today. Thank you for the work today in this last hour, all that you shared that I'm looking forward to returning to again and again. And thank you for what's to come. We have more today. We'll do this breakout group piece for a bit, and then we'll come back for question and answer time with you. And personally, I'll just say, in terms of journey, I hope for us as a community, this is only one of future opportunities to work with you and to work together as a community to do the thing that this event was called, speaking about race. I want, as we transition into this breakout group time, a couple of things I'm trying to hold on to in my mind were your invitations for us today, Zachary, to approach our work with compassion and curiosity. And in your presentation, you said the phrase, "the vulnerability is so hard to hold." You said a lot of phrases that I think I'm going to be working with for some time, but that one really resonated with me in the context of thinking about stepping into a breakout group time here together. Half an hour is not a long time, though in the midst it might feel like an eternity. I think as we transition into the time, I also just wanted to say a thank you really to all 250 plus people who are here. The planning committee, when we started thinking about this, thought, okay, well, we'll plan for this and we'll cap this event at 100 people because, you know, if we have 85 or 90, then if we have groups of about 6, we'll need about 16 or so breakout group facilitators. Well, the doors got blown off that very quickly. And I just want to say to us as a community, thank you for showing up. And I hope we can continue to show up around this. And then specifically, I want to say a very big thank you to the 48 of you who agreed to volunteer as breakout group facilitators today, for meeting with Dr. Green ahead of time in preparation, for considering these questions and how you might help us consider them together in smaller groups. The breakout group facilitators, just for everybody's sake, so you know, from the get-go, we've talked with Dr. Green about how the role is very much one of participant observer. We're all in these conversations together. These aren't breakout group leaders, these are facilitators, trying to help hold the frame for the group so that we can have some interactions together in our groups. Jeff Grant is going to be available for tech support. He's actually going to work all the tech behind this. So in a moment, he'll just put us into our groups. And some of you, if you encounter any technology issues, may wish to get a hold of him. And the chat is an option, but also he's made his cell phone number available, and I want to share it here. And perhaps, Jeff, you can put it into the chat at the same time for everybody. But if any of you would like to write this down, I'll say it now. To reach Jeff Grant, it's 206-414-9322. And thank you, Jeff, for being available. 250 plus people is a lot of people. So if you reach out to him and don't hear back right away, he might be responding to someone else, and he'll get around to responding to you as soon as possible. Let's talk together. I think to have a chance to put felt experience, put thoughts to words is important. It invites a different level of engagement. It invites us, any of us that might wish we could stay in a, can I just sit back and observe from afar? It invites us to step out of that kind of comfort zone. And so let's do that together. We'll meet for half an hour. And after that, I believe we will take a short break. Is that correct, Maxine and Dr. Green? Yes, so we'll go right.
Break now. Josh, actually, I'm hearing a lot of requests from people in the chat for a break before going into the breakout group.
Okay.
So that would make sense as a transition.
Let's do that. What time will we resume from the break?
How about we take a break now? We'll come back at 10:30 and get the group started. So a quick restroom,
Okay.
sips of coffee, and we'll get started.
7-minute break. We'll come back. If you show up just before 10:30, Jeff will have you in your groups, and we'll go till 11, and then we'll be all transported back to the main group to be able to spend the last portion with Dr. Green.
May I propose that the groups start in earnest at 10:35 and we come back so that it's a full half hour, because there are going to be invariably issues of joining and screens and microphones. So let's not have that eat up the time. Okay? Thank you.
Okay, we'll start in earnest at 10:35 and go to 11:05. And there's about 5 or 6 people per group for some of those who are asking in the chat. Okay, I will open the groups at about 10:35 or maybe 10:30, just to, does that sound good to you, Josh and Dr. Green? Okay, see you all in a few minutes.
I was asked to say a little bit after the breakout sessions about the process that we have going now. And so I'm going to read this. Forgive me for reading it. The poet William Stafford's poem, A Ritual to Read to Each Other, begins, "If you don't know the kind of person I am, and I don't know the kind of person you are, a pattern that others made may prevail in the world, and following the wrong God home, we may miss our star. Since long before recorded history, people have gathered in small groups and told to one another stories about who we are, what and who we know, what we think and feel, what we need, and what we fear. From those small groups, we carry those conversations out into the larger sphere, where they're shared again and again in many forms and for many reasons, where they become actions for better or for worse. Those groups, be they found around an ancient fire or in a breakout room, require one thing above all in order to function. The people in them must feel safe. Safe not only to share good ideas and exciting intentions, but also to open up those vulnerable places from which we can say, I am angry, I'm confused, I'm hurt, no matter how much you might want me to be so that you can feel better, I am not okay. And we must also feel free to say, I have done things that have harmed others. I didn't know, or I did know. I too am confused, and I'm trying to do better. It's easy to have good intentions when we create the kinds of spaces we have here today. It may be harder to accept the fragility of those spaces. We must assume the responsibility, each of us, to simply do better, to simply listen, and to believe the stories we hear for what they are, real and precious and an extraordinary gift, even when it hurts to receive them. And to carry that responsibility and humility out into other places to try to do good work. Stafford's poem ends with these words, never, I think, more important than now. For it is important that awake people be awake, or a breaking line may discourage them back to sleep. The signals we give, yes or no or maybe, should be clear. The darkness around us is deep. So I hope we can find courage in these rooms, the small ones and the large ones, to be clear and to love that clarity in one another. So thank you all for being part of what we're doing here today.
Thank you, Rebecca.